questions when we would have a chance to interact a little bit. There are so many of you. You know something about me already, probably. So I'm coming from Russia, and I enjoy researching soft power issues and cultural public diplomacy. I have been to China once, and I have been to the city of Xian specifically. As you can tell from my pronunciation, I don't really speak Chinese yet, but I will try to learn it once I come. Is my speed good for you? Do I not speak too fast? Okay, good. Well then, let's begin. So the topic of the lecture is cultural relations and cultural diplomacy. Why are these important and what are the differences between these two terms? So first of all, they are united by the concept of culture, right? And there is no uniform definition of culture. There are so many different ways to define it. But generally, culture is a sum of characteristics people share, yeah, such as language, religion, cuisine, social habits, arts. However, besides that, it's also a pattern of interactions and behavior received in society, right? So cognitive constructs. So it's not just something material that defines you, right? Not just what you wear, how and what you eat, yeah, what music you produce, but it's also about how you think, right? You are born into a family, into a certain society, you are taught certain social norms, and often you do not question these norms, right? So you're used to act in a certain way, you know this is how you should behave, and this is how you do behave. So on the picture, you can see Russian winter. There was a tradition of driving troikas. Yeah, you have 3 horses and they pull you. You can see some winter games on the scenery, people wearing some traditional clothes, right? People maybe talking to each other in a certain way, respecting social hierarchy of a kind. So this is about culture. Now, what are cultural relations? You know, some researchers go as far as to say that, primitive cultures existed in the Bronze Age many years ago. Yeah. So whenever two groups of people who already have some cultural heritage, some norms, traditions interact, these are cultural relations, meaning you do not need a state. Yeah. So you have a traveler coming from one place to another, bringing his attitudes, his cultural items with him, sharing it in the place he arrives, right? So this is already a sort of a cultural interaction. They can be direct and indirect, yeah? So let's say you are now in China, you know I'm from Russia, so you think, Russia is this country where we have the Red Square, where we had communism, where we have beautiful women, yeah? Probably you know some songs such as Katyusha, right? You probably, recall some names of famous people, could be some cultural figures or politicians, right? So these are some of your associations and ideas about the culture I am supposed to belong to, right? So this is already sort of an indirect interaction when you, for example, discuss among themselves what certain culture represents. So the thing is, you do not need a state. You do not need a state, right? As a private person, I go to China, I meet Chinese outside, I interact with the culture, right? It can be a non-governmental organization, not necessarily something sponsored by the state. However, in the field of international relations, right, international politics, we have schools of thought, such as realist tradition of thought. This is the most prominent school. And whenever we discuss the international environment through the prism of the school, we talk about some things such as national interests. Yeah, we talk about defense, security, we talk about resources, power struggle, and we don't really talk about culture. But some scholars argue that this is a distorted approach. It's a approach that should be changed. Why? Because basically every nation is already a culture. We are not just, a set of interests. We are not just defined by what our state needs or wants, right? Besides that,
Madina, sorry to interrupt. We're gonna change another computer. This is more clear.
of course, yeah.
Okay.
I can hear
Madina,
you.
the problem solved and the big picture is on the screen.
Oh,
So the student sitting far away can see the whole picture. That's all set. So we can start right now.
So, for example, the constructivist school of thought says that our national interests are constructed. Yeah. So, for example, if a country believes that it was an empire once, it should be an empire now, it will have a certain set of interests. If a country thinks of itself, right, its identity is more tied to the region. Consequently, this state will have different interests, right? So interests are not just something that is, set in stone. It's also something changeable. And how we react to what other people do is largely defined by our culture. So the school of thought that is solely focused on hard power interplay might be corrected. Yes, it might be amended by cultural approach as well. Furthermore, besides culture being a defining element in international relations, actually cultural relations include much more than, international politics as seen through the realist prism, right? Because it's also about all sorts of cross-national interactions, such as flow of migrants, right? Educational exchange, trade. Yeah, there are so many ways in which cultures interact. Perhaps the most, crucial element, the most crucial idea about cultural relations is that people who engage in them intentionally, they aspire for genuine reciprocity and mutual understanding. However, when we talk about diplomacy, because diplomacy is something necessarily associated with the state, it might bear connotations of instrumentalism. Yeah, instrumentalism meaning you want to achieve something. You bring your culture to the place, you talk about the culture, but you have some goal in mind why you're doing this, right? So you are self-interested. So cultural relations is something that grows organically. You do not interfere, you do not try to shape it to your liking. It's just something that evolves. So in contrast, cultural diplomacy is an action that is intentionally being carried out not necessarily by the state, right? But it is often sponsored or supported by the state. It can be a non-state actor as well, but state somehow interferes and helps the actor because state wants the culture to be attractive, to be at least appealing to the audiences, to be at least of some interest, so that the foreign policy the state pursues would be more broadly accepted, right? You know, as a state, you pursue some foreign policy, you want to sign a certain agreement, you want to, you know, in the extreme cases, it can be about territorial acquisitions, and you want to prepare soil for that. You want to prepare a favorable environment. So let's say you have a country where you have like a conflict with this country, and you establish your institute, and you go and you know, talk about how great your language is, how rich your culture is. This is probably not going to work, right? Because the overall environment is bad. But before this happens, you know, when the tone of the relationship is neuter or even positive, you can well promote your culture and hope it will be beneficial for your policies, right? So, whereas cultural relations is something organic and devoid of any self-interests, cultural diplomacy aims at preparing a soil for, you know, successful policy led by the state. We have an Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. It's an organization that is, I think it has a headquarters in the United States, and it also has an educational institute in Berlin. And they define on their page cultural diplomacy as having the ultimate goal of promoting peace and stability, right? Because, you know, when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, yes, when the basically the Cold War was over, there were speculations. Francis Fukuyama, for example, famously stated that this is the end of history, right? So the liberal system promoted by the West had won. Nothing more is in the sight, right? No more major transformation of the international political order is to occur. However, we now know he was wrong. This was not a very correct prediction. But there was also another famous researcher, Samuel Huntington, who said that from now on, we will have a competition of civilizations. It will not be just mere states who compete, but these will be, you know, the mentalities, the civilizational patterns. And so cultural diplomacy, in a sense, is a tool to, you know, eliminate, to alleviate this competition, this clash between civilizations, to try to make it peaceful. However, this definition is contested. So, for example, sometimes you want to have peace and stability, but you achieve it at the expense of something else. There are always within the society certain groups which are not happy with how resources are distributed, right? You might have some minorities, you might have some social layers who feel deprived, and they revolt, they want to change something in society. But let's say, you know, the state prefers, or I don't know, the current regime prefers, or it is somehow beneficial for the international stance of the state to stay stable, yeah, to keep peace at all costs, but to have to understand that perhaps this peace should not be the ultimate goal, right? So maybe this is not a very correct definition. Maybe cultural diplomacy is not as much about peace as it is, you know, as is given in this definition, about the promotion of one's interests. Do you have any questions this far? Perhaps you would like to pose a question. Feel free to do it. Okay, if there are no questions, let's move on. So, in the previous definitions, there were some words, some terms featured you might not be familiar with. So let me give you an idea. So, spectrum of influence, of course, we talk about the states, but we all understand that in today's world, these are not just the states who act. We have transnational corporations, yeah, we have international organizations, and they have their own capacity to act more or less independently. However, when we speak about the states, we normally say that they yield hard power, a traditional kind of power, but also soft power. It was Joseph Nye, an American political scientist, who coined the term soft power in 1980s. And from that time on, this concept became hugely influential. It has been researched, it has been implemented, incorporated in the policies of the states. So when we talk about cultural relations, you see on the scheme, they fall somewhere. They basically bring together this access to opportunity group and exchange, right? So when we talk about opportunity, we talk about sharing skills. Let's say state representatives come to a place, they engage in some educational activities. Or when we talk about exchange, it can be, establishing some sort of partnerships, links, or even trade. When we talk about cultural diplomacy and public diplomacy, you see another column appears here where we have cultural showcasing, broadcasting, trade promotion, tourism promotion. So again, the major difference is in that you promote something, right? When you showcase something, it means that you basically select what you show and what you prefer maybe not to show, right? And you can argue that the picture that is being created is distorted. But, because nowadays the world is more transparent, there are so many sources of information. It is not very smart for the state to be, incoherent in its messaging, right? So public diplomacy was supposed to be a positive version of the previously used term propaganda, right? Because propaganda we associated with, direct lying, yeah, very clear distortion of information for the purpose of, maybe to be regarded more favorably. Yeah, but basically you can never really tell, except you compare, you research the medium environment that we have. So the question is cultural diplomacy part of public diplomacy? Well, basically, the consensus among most scholars today is that yes, it is. Why? Because what is public diplomacy? Public diplomacy is basically communication with the foreign publics on behalf of the state, aimed at informing and influences audiences overseas, again, with a view to promote, to prepare a ground for pursuing certain national interests. So, well, we had a traditional public diplomacy, but from the 9/11 time on, yes, when the terrorist attack occurred, when there was a war on terror announced in the United States, there started, a discussion started in the United States. What have we been doing long all the way? Why our attempts at imposing democracy fail? Why does this happen? And the scholars, experts, they came to a view that it was too much of a one-way communication in the previous ways they practiced public diplomacy. Because what they did, they came, they, just basically shared what they had to share without necessarily, exhibiting any sort of curiosity towards the culture they are, communicating with. So they did not try to understand the other culture. It was too much of a unilateral effort. So now the idea was that new public diplomacy should be based on mutuality, right? So you present something, but you also listen. And Nicholas J. Call is a prominent researcher who works with the University of South California Center on Public Diplomacy, which is a really great institution. You know, they produce very high quality research. And he said that public diplomacy basically includes 5 components. It's listening, advocacy, yeah, this is showcasing, cultural diplomacy, exchange diplomacy, and international broadcasting, right? So cultural diplomacy as a subset of public diplomacy. Yeah, this is Nicholas J. Call, his recent book. So now that was all very much theoretical. Let me give you some practical examples. So around the middle of the 16th century, Matteo Rizzi was born in what is today's Italy, and he was sent by Jesuits to China later when he became a researcher, a well-known scientist. And he worked in China for around 30 years. Imagine he spent so much time in the country, which was so far. And at that time, of course, traveling was much more of a rare activity, right? And he was hugely successful. You know, he established contacts with many Chinese scholars. He taught and he introduced some of the Western ideas and inventions to China. He also learned a lot from, you know, contacts with the local scholars. And he was even invited to work in the court of emperor, right? So Jesuits, they had their own community. It was not, you know, he was not sent there by the state. He was not an ambassador, right? He was not a consular. He was, in a sense, a representative of this religious group. And you see, when he arrived to China, he was open-minded. He wanted to learn about the country. He saw in Confucianism and Taoism aspects that were somehow, you know, falling in line with what Bible taught, with what Roman Catholicism advocated. And he tried to integrate Christian beliefs with some of the traditional Chinese beliefs. But this was not at all welcomed by the Catholic Church. So eventually, you know, the Catholic Church tried to somehow cut even ties off, because for them it was, you know, they wanted their faith, their dogma to stay pure. They did not welcome this kind of integration. But if you look at it, well, this is a great example of cultural relations, right? More or less an independent interaction between a representative of, you know, European Western culture and Chinese culture, open-minded without having any interests in mind, right? Because he was a scientist. This is a picture of him. And here are some examples of cultural diplomacy. So there can be several forms it takes, such as foreign exhibitions, concerts, publications, exchange of scholars and artists and workshops. Here you can see some pictures. So this picture with the woman, there was an exhibition of the culture of Uganda in Moscow last summer, I believe. So they brought many of their products to Moscow. They were, you know, they were on sale, so you could buy those products. And yeah, so this was one example. It was not exactly an exhibition. It was something in between, because you also had some artists showcasing their works. And I purchased some foods there. They were very delicious. And of course, it kind of improved my idea of their culture. Not as if I knew this much about it, before that, but so you can say that it's a cultural information, right? Because it was something new to me. Sometimes people know nothing about your culture. So, for example, we now have a professor from Hungary who joined us. And I'm just wondering how many of you know where Hungary is? Do you know this country? Hungary. Well, this is a country in Eastern Europe. You might, have a look later what it is. But yeah, the point is basically sometimes you just have to come out there and just say, okay, we exist. This is who we are. This is what we have to share, right? This is our heritage. Sometimes you just have to, yeah. And another picture, this was a workshop organized by, I think, some of the Chinese community in Budapest, in Hungary, because I studied there. And you can see me wearing a traditional dress. I would very much like to maybe have one for myself, because it was, available to try it on. It was a cultural workshop. So they were, speaking about Chinese culture, some traditional aspects, some very modern developments. We could, practice some calligraphy. We could try some foods. And this is a great example, I would say, of a cultural capacity building, because you bring people together, you share some information, but you also network, right? So you establish lasting connections. And maybe later on, you will want to have a common project with those people, right? So you already have some confidence that they know you, that they appreciate you, you appreciate them back. So you have a bond formed. Now I want to give you an example and ask you to tell me if this is a cultural relations or cultural diplomacy. So this is a story about how tea arrived to Russia. In Russian language, tea is chai. Yeah, so not very different from how you call it in Chinese. And there was like a story of how Russians were exposed to tea. We had Cossacks. These were independent horses riding. I would not call them tribes, but just like a group of people who were more or less nomads in the Far East. So they were around those territories bordering today's Mongolia, I think, somewhere there. And they knew, of course, something about the tea. But the court of the Tsar, yeah, the capital of Russia, was very far from there. And, the elites knew nothing about that drink in the 17th century. But then something happened, you know. In what is today's Mongolia, there were some internal disputes between Khans. And one Khan, Altin, he reached out to the Tsar, Fyodor Mikhailovich, in Moscow, and he said, can you please help me against my adversary? Because I want to become the next Khan, and he wants to fight me. And the Tsar, the Russian Tsar, said, yes, we will, but please sign this swear of allegiance. So sign this paper saying that, we are friends and you are basically under our, I don't know what to call it. Well, in a sense, you will not do anything against us. This is what he wanted him to sign. But the Khan was reluctant. Khan didn't want to commit to anything. So there was like an exchange of messages, some exchange of gifts, and the Russian ambassador, you can call him so, a consular, he received some tea bags from Khan, but he didn't want to take them because he didn't know what it is. He didn't think it was something valuable. So he was like, no, no, no. But Khan convinced him. And then on another occasion later, there was another Russian consular sent this time already to Beijing. And he was also gifted some tea. But again, they didn't know it was something precious. And only later, when the years passed, the tea became a drink hugely popular among Russian elites, and everyone started to drink it. So you can see on the picture, traditional house, everyone sits at the table drinking tea. You have this samovar, this kind of a fancy teapot, fancy Russian teapot. So, do you think this story is more an example of cultural relations, or is it more an example of cultural diplomacy? What do you think? Maybe someone is saying something in the back, but I cannot hear.
Cultural relation.
Yes. Can you give any arguments why?
There's a diplomacy making by government with this gift and some message exchange and become popular in those two countries. There's kind of, conversation between two culture, and we'll probably call it cultural relation.
Yes, yes, I agree with you. The thing is, why you could maybe think that it can also be cultural diplomacy, because on these two occasions, this gift was granted by a person associated with the state, right? So when it was Altin Khan, he was a state official basically, or when Fyodor Baikov was gifted tea in Beijing, it was also, given by a person maybe close to the emperor. But it was not an explicit action aimed at promoting, right, the Chinese or Mongolian culture. It was more of, and just an element in this interaction. And especially if you take the whole story of how tea came to Russia, with the first exposures by the Cossacks, with the reasons why the tea ultimately became accepted and grew hugely popular. Of course, this is more about culture. So, for example, the way the tea ceremony was organized, the way tea was as a ritual, tea drinking was carried out in China, was not very much known to the Russian court, nor was it something like appealing to them, something they would consider. But because the Russian court at that time was very much looking towards the West, towards Europe, and Europe also started to drink tea, so that somehow affected, right, the Russian elites, and they also started to drink tea more than they used to before. So, right, this is more about cultural relations. Let's talk about the roots of cultural diplomacy. How did it come into existence? So, as is often the case in social sciences, the term arrives much later. Yeah, the term is pinned much later than the very phenomenon appears. And it was only in the 1950s that some researchers in the US proposed this word. But of course, cultural diplomacy existed, for a long time already. In the middle of 17th century, you had Académie Française appearing established in France. It was an institution supposed to take care of the language, right? So to see if the language is being used correctly, if nothing bad occurs to the language, if the standards are set, maybe also what people are being taught. But because it was a very turbulent time, there was nothing much in between the time when this academy was established and the Alliance Française was founded in the end of the 19th century. And you can basically say that this was the moment when the true institutionalization of cultural nationalism, appeared. Because France, clearly, it was a colonial state, and the French were very of, being positively regarded by their colonies, in their colonies. Or if not, because you don't want to just govern, to just rule by hard power. It is always either when the people like you, right? So the very idea of soft power, Joseph Nye introduced, was that, you can get people to do what you like without forcing them, without coercing them to do so. You basically lead by example. People like your lifestyle, your products, they look up to you, and they are naturally prone to maybe copying your ways of living, maybe even adhering to your values, right? So this is a soft power. And language, of course, as an essence, as maybe the most precious element of the culture, was taken care of and very much understood in France. So, you always had missionaries, you always had people who would independently go overseas to promote the religion, first of all, but also the language and maybe some cultural habits. But the state only got increasingly involved in that in Europe in the end of the 19th century. So you can see, for example, this Società Dante Alighieri, an Italian cultural institute. It was also established around the time. It was not always supported by the state, but once the state understood it can be a powerful tool, state also became a stakeholder, started to sponsor. You can see a picture in the top right corner. This is a picture of a library in Alexandria that was built by, the Greeks when they conquered this territory. Again, long time ago, long before Académie Française even was established. So you can say that this was also an early example of a cultural diplomacy, right? State-supported initiative to be regarded more favorably, right? To establish some scientific exchange. But again, historically speaking, this is what we talk about, the end of the 19th century. Then later, in the middle of the 20th century, you had some other institutes appearing. Of course, 20th century was a wartime. You had the First World War, you had the Second World War. And so you can see that this period is called cultural propaganda. This is like a timeline. And cultural propaganda, why was it called this way? Because it was a messaging intended to, again, distorted messaging used to achieve some aims. So, for example, in 1914, I think it was, that the Committee on Public Information was established in the United States. Basically, the sole purpose of this organization was to spread the word about, the good of war. Why should Americans subscribe to, enlist and go to take part in this remote war that started somewhere in Europe? Like, why? They wanted to advocate this somehow. But this was a communication with their publics, but they also wanted to make sure that the publics of other states engaged in the war would see them as a good force, right? Not just some kind of imperialist power that just wants to extract some resources to gain something. This is why it joins the war. But as a power that, enters the war because it believes that this is a good thing to do, because we have to fight evil. Yeah, this is like a Wilsonian approach. There was an American president, Woodrow Wilson, who was famous for this political moralism, one of the American traditions, right? So, but what is crucial here, what I want to you to take note of course, the authoritarian, even totalitarian states, they also practiced cultural diplomacy. So, for example, Nazi Germany, they created a European Writers' Union where they had certain like standards, norms. They had their vision of what European literature should look like, right? For example, the Franquist Spain, when there was this authoritarian ruler, Franco, there was a section of the party, feminine section, and you see on the picture below and in black and white, women were touring around the world, dancing. Yeah, so they wanted people across the globe to regard Franquist Spain positively. But of course, if you dance well, it does not necessarily justify you, curtailing people's rights or imposing your political vision. However, this was again a cultural tool. Now, of course, cultures are not equal in a sense that they're not the same. So you can have a strong culture, you can have a weak culture. It's not to say that, being strong is positive or being weak is negative. It's more about the level of cohesion between the people. Yeah. Just how much the culture really affects the actual lives people lead, right? So, strong culture, for example, German culture, Goethe Institute promotes a strong conception of German culture, which includes, some philosophical traditions, some like history, certain, social norms, whereas Anglo-Saxon cultures are more relaxed in this sense. They are weaker cultures, right? So these are cultures that are more individualistic, right? You can live the way you want. You can have your own vision. You can have your own values. It's just that you belong to a certain country. You are a citizen of a certain country. You speak a certain language, right? And you also share some norms, but you do not necessarily have a common purpose with the other people, right? So strong cultures normally promote group conformity, group harmony, common purpose. Individualistic cultures, they encourage creativity, independence, but there might be, less of social cohesion in this sense. So just to to give you a try, do you think Russian culture is more of a strong culture in this sense, or is it more of a weak culture?
It's pretty strong.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think so?
Because before the USSR time, it was a bunch of culture. I don't know how to speak in English. Um, Sarvan, is that called?
What?
Sarvan.
Mm-hmm.
Probably I saw this pretty strong because in back in the day of USSR
Yes.
against
Yeah.
Germany's in World War II, it was pretty strong. People get together.
Mm-hmm.
There was a mine and attack, people get beat up and save the world. Probably can say that to beat the Germany government. Which
Yeah. I mean, you know what? Yeah. When we learn history in Europe, we tend to have a very Eurocentric picture because we, of course, also World War II was also led in Asia, basically, and China also lost so many people. But yeah, here I just want to mention that Russian culture has its extremes. So sometimes you see people who are very individualistic, but in some other respects, people unite. Yeah, there is some nationalism, some national spirits. And when you talk about the communist past, yeah, the Soviet Union, of course, there was a lot of group conformity. There was this state promoted idea that we built socialism. Yeah, so people were supposed to sacrifice. So of course, in this sense, it was a strong culture. And, we always talk like, is Russia more of an Eastern state, of a Western leaning culture? Basically, both. Yeah. It's hard to be torn apart all the time. We have elements of both. But Chinese culture, you would probably agree, it's more of a strong culture, right? So you might have some Western influence nowadays. Attitudes change, right? People have more opportunities, people travel, people, rethink some things.
Roots
But
never
generally,
change. I mean, the roots never changes. All those are information from the outside.
yeah, this is, I just included this slide to, to make sure you understand that, of course, cultural diplomacy also varies in methods, in tools, and in the way it influences the audiences, partly because of what conception of culture you mean, right? So maybe if it's just a weak conception of culture, maybe it's easier to attract people, because strong culture requires more, maybe, dedication to learn it, to feel like you belong to it, right? So maybe that's the reason why the Anglo-Saxon culture and languages spreads faster, right? More easily. And now, lastly, let's talk about cultural diplomacy during the Cold War. This is a hugely interesting subject. I don't know how much you know about the Cold War.
About 50 years.
Hmm?
This process. It's from probably after the World War II to the new century, 21st century. It's a long period.
Yes. So yes, indeed, it's a long period. People study Cold War. They basically divide it into several periods. Yeah, post-war period, first detente, then again relationships grew colder when the leadership changed, and then you had the second detente, and eventually Soviet Union relaxed its ideological position. Yeah, and things changed. But normally, the researchers do not talk much about the cultural aspect. We focus so much on especially the security part of it, because both states acquired nuclear weapons. This is viewed as a factor that contributed to them, to the leadership of the states, being willing to come to the negotiating table, right? Because you cannot actually engage in a full-scale nuclear war. That would be a disaster. There was an idea of mutually assured destruction, so-called MAD, right? Abbreviation. Because they knew that, if somebody decides to start a nuclear war, most likely no one will survive. So, the leadership understood that basically the fate of the whole planet depends on them. They were coming to some sort of agreements, helped by some European leaders too. But normally, regarding cultural relations, Cold War history barely mentions cultural exchange between the states, even though, diplomatic ties were not broken off between Soviet Union and the United States. Trade indeed was negligible. Why? I think it's easy to understand. When you have an adversary, especially an adversary who lags behind you in some science and technological aspects, as Soviet Union did on many occasions, in some years, in certain sciences, certain fields. Of course, the United States would not be willing and would not let Europe to open up to the trade with the Soviet Union, because they were afraid that they use it to, to further invest in maybe arms or whatever, some other spheres that would help them eventually win this war. But let us not forget that this was a war of ideas, maybe even in the first place. So it cannot be researched without focusing on the cultural aspect too. And the thing is, culture was very much centralized in the Soviet Union. So you had this organization, you can see a logo, which was like basically an organization that was supposed to manage the relationships of the Soviet Union with the foreign states. But of course, at that time, it was largely like communist or non-aligned states. There was not much exchange with the capitalist bloc. And yeah, so when just the revolution happened in Russia, there was some interaction in the early 20s, 30s between Soviet Union and the US. There was some minor even tourism between them. But in the late 30s, Stalin grew. You can speculate on his personality, but basically his personality, his individual qualities, very much changed the course of history. And he grew increasingly fearful and increasingly unwilling to open up. So basically, the Soviet Union cut off all foreign access. Before that, there were some cultural exchanges. Late 30s, not much anymore. And then, sometime later, the United States followed up. So they signed two McCarran Acts that prohibited non-official figures from coming to the United States. So Soviet citizens, they were not allowed to come to the United States unless it would be an official visit, absolutely necessary, approved, confirmed by both sides. And so around that time in early 50s, United States Information Agency was established. So basically, what was happening? The Soviet Union had a reputation of a country that backs liberation movements in the so-called third world countries. It had more of a positive image, whereas the United States, with its engagement in the Korean War, we're going to talk about that next time when we talk about Soviet-Chinese relations, because we know Korean War, the Soviet Union also had a chance to maybe get involved, but it preferred to use China as a proxy. But anyway, the United States were not quite satisfied with their image. They felt like to win this war of ideas, they have to invest. And they did successfully. So there was the Family of a Man, a photographic exhibition that toured around the world, wherein they, presented some glimpses into American life. Yeah, to show the diversity, the strength, the opportunities. Yeah, to showcase the America as the land of opportunity. And, Stalin died in 1953. Many things changed. And the American National Exhibition even came to Moscow in 1959. So they came to Moscow. They were able to showcase some of their cultural achievements. But basically, it was a Cold War, cold informational war. The Soviet Union was not open to any incoming information, although it was engaged as usual in dissemination of some, brochures, some broadcasting, that of course were partly cut off again in the capitalist world. It's not true to say that in the capitalist states they had all the access to the information coming from the Soviet Union, but not the other way around. No, of course, in the United States in particular, there was so-called movement of McCarthyism, when they did everything they could to avoid communist ideas from even infiltrating the country, also sort of a paranoia. So basically every side had an objective to maximize the penetration of the other society in terms, again, of ideas, and to minimize the exposure of its own, right? So I do not want to be affected by your ideas, but I want you to be affected by mine. So the war could not be, terminated unless the political system of the adversary changes. Yeah, it's been overthrown. Of course, Soviet Union was gradually opening up. So, for example, the Soviet they held exhibitions in the Third World, and they were cooperating with China in Asia to promote communist ideas. And gradually, even between the United States and the Soviet Union, some negotiations unfolded. So they were discussing just how much how much exposure to each other they are willing to tolerate. Yeah, in arms it was a little bit easier because both sides were interested. Both sides understood they have to impose certain restrictions, not to be at a risk of a constant nuclear strike. But Soviet Union, they did not compromise on issues concerning free information flows, right? So even when the visa regime was eased, the Americans, they could come to the Soviet Union much easier than the Soviet citizens would go to the United States. And eventually the American consumerism, it held indeed more of an appeal than what the Soviet Union had to offer, right? Because again, all the literature, all the cultural activities, they were much centralized. Although, when Stalin died, for example, before that, Soviet Union never showcased anything, any cultural heritage that originated from the pre-Soviet Russia. After that, to make Soviet Union come across as more, multifaceted, more appealing entity. In the exhibitions, they also included some older cultural heritage, right? Some 19th century ballet, movies, yeah. However, later on, when Khrushchev was the head of state who succeeded Stalin, who famously denounced Stalin, and Mao Zedong was not happy about that. Again, we're going to talk about that next time. But when Brezhnev came to power, he drastically reduced the cultural exposure to the capitalist world because the Soviet leaders felt threatened by this development. But again, Brezhnev, some other party leaders, they did not stay for long. And when Gorbachev came to power, things changed. Eventually, Soviet Union collapsed. Maybe, as Xi Jinping said, no one was man enough to prevent this development. When we discuss, what led to the collapse, to the, dissolution of the union, we also talk about some internal reforms that were needed, but there was no one to introduce them. Gorbachev tried to reform something. Again, as we see, eventually it led to dissolution of the union. Regarding the pictures, the images you see on the slides, jazz was, a very popular music genre that was developing in the United States. And, the musicians, they positioned themselves as apolitical. So they said, okay, this is the music that its spirit is free, right? So we are apolitical, but again, the state, the US, when they were broadcasting, when they were showing the world what they have, the richesse, they used the musicians too, right? So famously Beatles, when they arrived, when the Soviet people, they started to listen to their music, no one could anymore keep telling them that, everything is so bad in capitalist world, because they already knew, they already had their own standards. If the person says that Beatles are bad or tries to promote this idea, there is probably something wrong with the person, right? So the trust in the state disseminated information was vanishing. And below you see an expo at a Montreal exhibition in 1967. Yeah. So this is an example of how USSR pavilion looked like. You had, of course, Lenin, you had some pieces of art, you had some I think this is a model of a satellite to the left, right? So showcasing some scientific and cultural achievements. And the United States Information Agency was actually dissolved, or at least it was integrated into the State Department when the Soviet Union fell apart, right? So basically, before that, in the United States, culture was mostly something delegated to non-state actors. There were many private initiatives, and only with the advent of this global contest was the American state involved in, culture was basically weaponized. This is all I wanted to share with you today. A little bit about what we're going to talk about next time. I think you had